program in science, technology, and society at MIT. And with me is also Dr. Yarden Katz, sitting here. Yarden, you want to raise your stand up, or because he'll be our next speaker on the 14th on artificial intelligence. So I want to thank Yarden first, and then I want to thank few other people. I want to thank those who are present here. Dr. Humuk Amax, who's a former scientist, now helps out people with videography and live streaming. He took all the trouble coming from Providence, spending the night and doing this session with us. And then Mike Passerini. Mike is local. He's also a professional videographer helping us. So today we are live streaming this program as well as videotaping, which all of these will be on YouTube once our sessions are over. I wanted to thank, although I don't see anyone from Radius, the MIT's organization called Technology and Culture Forum, otherwise known as Radius, and very kind to co-sponsor this with STS. And they did the postering and publicity and so forth. So we are very thankful to Trish Weinman from Radius, as well as Christina English, who did the poster. We also have Alan Reese from the West Coast, who's doing the live streaming. It's a pretty high-tech operation here, I guess appropriate for MIT. And so we are, Alan is on the West Coast and Humuk is here. And we're live streaming from there. First, just to reiterate, we have 3 sessions. You don't have to come to the other 2, or you can come to this and another one. Especially, I recommend you try to come to Yarden's session on next Thursday, because it's a very important topic, the use of artificial intelligence in our weapons systems now. That's being heavily pushed by the Pentagon. And the hype regarding artificial intelligence in all spheres of economy, commerce, and social media, et cetera. So very important that people get to hear Yarden next Thursday. The next 2 sessions are going to be in room 2105, not 2190. So if you happen to be attending them, just make a note that we had actually a room change just for today because of setup requirements, the live streaming, et cetera. We needed a lot more time, and 2105 was not available. And so 3 sessions. First one, talk about the politics, the military-industrial complex, defense budget, why is it so difficult to change, and so forth. Second, on artificial intelligence. And third one is to talk about the tremendous waste in our defense programs. And from my own experience as a former employee of the House Armed Services Committee and also the Government Accountability Office, about the kind of things I found, and I became a whistleblower on the missile defense program. So I will talk from personal experience with data, of course, about this. So today's session the timing is perfect, I guess. We are going to talk about endless wars. And here we are in the beginning of another episode of invasion of perhaps another major country in the Middle East. I hope certainly that doesn't happen, but the killing of a major figure in the Iranian government, in the Iranian nation, and a general on Iraqi soil certainly was way beyond the pale. And normally, United States, despite the invasions and stuff that we do not openly do these kinds of things. But Trump is very close to Israel, and I think that Israel had a lot to do with Trump's Middle East policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians and Iranians in particular. So there is this politics of Israel that affects our politics here so greatly that he felt emboldened to do this kind of thing. Because even though I understand President Obama and George Bush all had the coordinates of General Soleimani. They decided that there was this understanding that we're not going to do something like this. So it's very serious, and what will happen, nobody knows. So more people understand about the drivers of these endless wars and weapon systems and so forth. And it is so difficult to change anything. I've been doing this for 2 years, this course, and I also teach regularly a similar course of all places in Japan at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. And the reason for their interest, and there are a lot of student and some faculty interest in Tokyo, and I give also talks in other places there, that they buy enormous amount of gear, equipment from the United States. So several things that are immediately on their radar is this F-35 aircraft, which is an enormously expensive, supposedly a Generation 5 aircraft that's not even meeting Generation 4 performance. And people are paying a huge price to buy this aircraft. So that there is a lot of interest in Japan. And our students at Tokyo Tech, a lot of them come from JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, the military academies and so forth, try to understand the dynamics in the United States about development of weapon systems and why this goes on the way it goes on. And so without much further ado, hopefully the technology will not, so Mike, I'll use your, okay, good. Okay, so what I'm going to try to talk about today is, some of you may already know this stuff quite well, so you have to bear with me. Just the mechanisms of the federal budget, the kinds of amounts of monies we are talking about, and then the defense budget itself, and the process in Congress where I was for some time, and all the politics involved, and then introduce the notion, and people here, it's becoming quite a cliche now that the term military-industrial complex is heard all the time now. So I want to put a little flesh on this term from my own experience, having worked in the national security area in Washington, and how the military-industrial complex is so influential in making this juggernaut just keep going. In many unnecessary, very expensive weapons. And I will use for the last class is my experience with the missile defense program by citing a couple of programs and give details to you in terms of what kind of waste is continuing to happen in this particular program, which has so far spent $300 billion. So here is the federal budget. And of course, it's huge, $4.7 trillion, $4,700 billion, the total federal budget. It has got two components. They nominally, one is mandatory and the other is discretionary. And the mandatory programs are like the net interest, the Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and so forth. But I would point you to the net interest because that is something becoming so big, and that's the interest that we have to pay for the debt servicing. So these enormous spendings in the budget for military doesn't come for free. Not only that, it produces many unnecessary weapons, infeasible physically weapons, but they also make this interest payment a huge number, an amazing number, $479 billion this year, simply for paying the debt. So that's the mandatory part, and the discretionary part is the red, blue, and red and the blue. And that comes to a total of about 1.3 trillion. And I will argue that even though defense is actually put in the discretionary budget, because every year there's a defense bill that comes before Congress, and the Congress supposedly debates it, but there is really no debate on the defense bill. The defense budget does not go down $1 from the amount that is requested by the president every year, not $1. So every year when I was there, my boss and another congressperson from Colorado, some of you may have heard, she's many years ago, Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, a very famous congressperson from Colorado. She used to sit on the House Armed Services, and they together introduced an amendment that said, cut the defense budget by $1. Oh, no problem. Welcome, Trish. Thank you. I already thanked you, but
I'm going to go get them.
okay.
You might have to recap a little bit. There are a lot of people in another room.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can we just stop for 5 minutes? Alan? Okay, so let them then come in. Okay, so it's a 5-minute break already. Yeah. In the meantime. People maybe just put their name and email. So if there is a snowstorm or something, that I can get back to them. So please, yeah, sign the attendance sheet. It's not a attendance, but the department likes to see many people show up for this kind of sessions, because this is not a regular STS colloquium or anything. So they want to judge student and non-student interest in things like that. So just the email address, and if you have any affiliation, MIT, non-MIT, then I can pass it on to the department. I think this is a good place. We can just start here with the federal budget, and yeah.
I understand. No, we're going to keep it going. Okay, carry on with the show. Well, they haven't started flowing yet.
So people went by mistake to 102, 105. Oh, it's partly my mistake. I was going to leave a sign there because the room change happened, and but it was on the poster. Sorry.
He's still streaming.
He's still streaming.
Well, there's no way to turn it off.
Oh, okay. So
So if you can share chat.
yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, I was just saying about, and I guess this is a good stopping point because it was starting out the federal budget, but and these are sort of ancillary comments that you look at the budget, this $4.7 trillion, and you have the part that can be subject to legislation is only 1.3 trillion. So it's only 25% of the budget is discretionary. Rest are non-discretionary. You have to pay for Social Security as you go, pay for Medicare, and that sort of thing. But I really think that the debt servicing is a huge amount that people should need to pay more attention. That the spending on defense budget that is approaching now $1 trillion does not come for free. We can print money for some time, but it just doesn't come for free. On the same token, I would actually sort of make the point that the defense budget, which is approaching, as I said, under Trump, about $1 trillion, the defense budget is such a sacred cow that it is in effect a non-discretionary. Because I was just saying that when the defense budget comes from the president to Congress in January of each year, there is a lot of fanfare in the media about what's in the budget, what's not in the budget, et cetera, et cetera. But if you keep your eye on the money and follow the money, you will see there is that money never, there is no reduction ever in the budget. It's just almost, and I will show you so I think we have everybody now. So, okay. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, okay. Okay. I'm sorry and apologize for this last minute room change. And we thought Christina, who did the poster for us, it got into the thing, and I just didn't remember to put a sign up on 2105 that there's been a room change. And of all things, the next two sessions are back in 2105. So it's truly confusing. Our starting time was 5:30. I started at 5:40. Yes, but so I can quickly do it. So I was hoping that I would cut short my presentation so we have more time for Q&A, but I've already lost about 20 minutes. So, but anyway, so start out, and the quick announcement is that 3 sessions you can attend, any one of the 3, including today's, but I would again urge you to attend the next session. And on artificial intelligence, that's an addition to my regular course. And again, Yarden, maybe stand up one more time to recognize Yarden Katz, who will be our lecturer on the next session. So please plan on that. But it's 2105 and start at 5:30. And so I will start out quickly saying that we are in the beginning of potentially another devastating war in the Middle East. I just hope it doesn't happen like many other people, but it is just so, I mean, the effect of the killing of Soleimani must be so incredible in Iran. The general who has been part of their revolution has been 40 years, has been there. And we had an understanding, the US military and the Iranians had an understanding that this wouldn't happen. And especially this wouldn't happen on the Iraqi soil when he was invited by the Iraqi prime minister to come, apparently carrying a message of some kind of a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had made a proposal to Iran via Iraq, and the Iraqi prime minister was acting as a go-between. And now he was going to attend the meeting in a few hours, and he was blown up. So you can imagine today, 50 people were killed in the birthplace of General Soleimani because of the stampede. They did not expect the kind of people. I was just watching some BBC, and it's just incredible how many people are there. So it is obviously nobody talks about it. Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of President Roosevelt, was the person who was instrumental in writing the United Nations Charter. Instrumental that the United States was in the leadership of doing the United Nations Charter. And we are now one of the worst violators of United Nations Charter. So it's a very sad day for the United States, I would think. regardless of whether Soleimani had been a general who had been instrumental in killing many US soldiers. This is war. We kill them, they kill us. That's what's going on. So cannot hold a particular person responsible for that and then blow him up, especially from his position. So anyway, I hope it doesn't go worse than that, but it is a continuation, unfortunately, of these of endless wars. And that is a phrase actually that Trump used in his 2016 campaign. Quite amazing. So we will quickly go over the drivers of this continuous wars and massive buildup of weapons that we don't need. And so my experience having worked on the House Armed Services Committee and the House International Relations Committee before coming to MIT gives me some unique vantage point of looking at these things from at fairly high levels from the inside of the Beltway, as they say. So I will introduce the federal budget quickly and the defense budget, make some comments. A lot of people are familiar now with these things, especially here in Cambridge and MIT. But regardless, I think we just should be on the same page and discuss the legislative process and the politics of the budget. And then hopefully go into a discussion of introducing the notion of the much cliched term, the phrase, the military-industrial complex, but really put some flesh to this from my own experience, having worked in the national security arena in Washington at fairly high levels, and how the military-industrial complex that it is, even though it's a nebulous concept, but it is really made up of people in many institutions, many organizations of the government, outside the government, Congress, contractors that drive this policy, that presidents actually have very little power to change this direction that comes out of this complex. And I will try to explain that. And then finally, I will try and make some comments, if time permitting, about the enormous waste in these systems that we have been building that are unnecessary, and why they continue to go on. We cannot stop them. Our politicians are simply incapable of reducing the defense budget, which is now approaching almost $1 trillion, cannot reduce it even by a token $1 at any time since the 1970s, 1980s, 1970s, mid-70s after Vietnam War. So let's just, so this is the federal budget. It is a $4.7 trillion pie. But the thing is, most of it is not subject to discussion, meaning it's not subject to the discretion of Congress. I mean, the congressional appropriation process only deals with only quarter of the federal budget, which is about 1.3 trillion. And that contains the defense budget as a big part. And the other part is relatively small compared to everything else. And we have the fight over it, call it the guns and the butter debate. But really, there is no debate over the guns. It's always about whether you get a butter that is 100%, or you get some kind of a dietary butter. So the debate is over very small amounts of money, and people forget where the real money is there that is often sometimes not accountable. So the blue and the red are the defense and the other non-defense civilian discretionary budget, and that's about 1.3 billion. And this is the breakdown of the $1.3 billion discretionary budget. And you will see again that the defense is just towering over everything. 718 billion is the budget, that amount that was requested by Trump. What the Congress passed is 733 billion. So not only that budget was at an incredibly high level, it's higher than it's ever been, even in the highest Cold War levels in 86, 87. And now it's at that level, and people added another 15 to 20 billion to it for their favorite programs, because that's the only budget that passes, regardless of some opposition, that passes overwhelmingly. Because it's very difficult for members of Congress to vote against the national defense authorization because of it is the national defense. So using that concept, people go after congressional people and force them to vote on these bills. But it is really amazing how little money is there for everything else out of this budget. I already talked about the mandatory and the part of the budget that is not subject to discretion, and all these entitlement programs and so forth. And in the discretionary part is the 1.3. One thing that is, I was just saying that as a previous remark before everybody else came here, is that the debt servicing part of the mandatory budget is over $400 billion. It's a couple of slides before this. 479 billion is the mandatory interest payment from our budget. That's huge. $500 billion just goes. So why I'm bringing this up and pointing this out is that people don't talk about the consequences of this incredible amount of defense spending, but the consequence is that the deficit is up and the debt is up. So the public debt is up, and we got to pay these incredible amounts of money from the taxpayers. So, and the other thing is somewhat facetiously, is the defense budget should really be a part of the mandatory, because there are people who really see its character in the political sense, that we cannot debate the defense budget. Really, we cannot. My boss and another congresswoman from Colorado, Pat Schroeder, used to introduce a $1 reduction amendment from the top line of the defense bill since the 1970s in the Vietnam War. It did not pass one time. It could not even pass the committee markup because nobody would cut the top line and set a precedence. So always the top line goes up. Whatever the president requests, it goes up even more. So it never goes down, sometimes maybe the same as the president requested. So it really belongs to the mandatory part. So in the legislative process, what happens is every January, actually the budget arrives even before that. The budget is written by the OMB, and then Office of Management and Budget, and it comes to Capitol Hill. So I was on the House Armed Services when I dealt with the budget, and then there were Senate staffers who were dealing with the budget. So on both houses, you have a huge hundreds of pages, what is then called the National Defense Authorization Bill, because it authorizes the Defense Department to spend the money that the appropriators will eventually appropriate. But the authorizers are very important. They're not as important as the appropriators, because if the authorizers ask for some money on some particular item and the appropriators don't appropriate the money, then it is difficult. The Pentagon will not honor that. But so normally there is a little tug of war with the appropriators and authorizers, but that's sort of inside baseball. It's more is the authorizers write the language describing the rationale and the justification for each program. That's why it's about very thick. And there is a lot of good information. People who want to dig into understanding programs and their funding and their history it's a good place to do that. So once that thing comes, it is the frenzy of requests from members. When I was there, I was a minority staff member, Democrat, so I had a tremendously huge portfolio because we had only 7 staffers on the House Armed Services Committee. So I had a whole portfolio of defense R&D. It's a budget item. It's called RDT&E, Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation. At that time, this is late 1990s, 97, 98, our budgets were about 55 billion, the RDT&E budget. The RDT&E budget is now close to 100 billion. It's 80 something billion this year, I understand. I haven't looked into the details, but so once that comes, we get requests from all the members that I need 5 million for my program. Somebody needs another 5 million for his program or her program. And there's letters just come, and we have to then try to figure out how to add to the budget and justify it to the committee hearing. Not much of a justification. It's just once the money is divvied up, they will determine how much to add every year, called plus up. When the plus up is determined, then you sort of get the division, and depending on your clout as a member of Congress. So the budget is marked up. The bill is by each congressional committee, House and Senate Armed Services. Then it's put forth amendments in the committee, and then goes to the full House for amendments, and then a full House vote. So at the end, you have a product that has got the request plus another 20, 50, $15 billion, whatever every year. And so then the House and the Senate each has their pet programs. So there is some reconciling that has to be done once the 2 bills are passed, and then a joint bill is passed by both houses, and then the president signs it into law. So there is hardly really any real debate. It's just maybe some juggling, pushing around some money from this program to that program. So that's the budget process. And again, once this is done, as soon as the authorization, which it has, 2 weeks ago, it just passed the $733 billion budget, and the Democrats voted for it. There was an amendment in this particular legislation, which called for no war against Iran without congressional approval. And that budget amendment, that amendment to the bill had passed the full Congress on the House side, not on the Senate side, on the House side. And this was stripped off in the House-Senate conference that just happened. So I guess Democrats are now crying foul that they knew the president had some plans against Iran. And so there was a lot of pressure from the White House to stop that. So just to show pictorially, this is the motto of the Appropriations Committee, because once the authorization battle is over, then the battle, or not battle so much, just the action moves towards the Appropriation Committee. Most of their hearings are classified, closed hearings. On the authorization side, most of our hearings used to be open, but the majority party primarily determines who's going to testify, mostly in favor of more increases for missile defense or some ships or airplanes or whatever. So the appropriation is really the crucial thing in the power of Congress in the whole business of defense comes in. In other programs as well, but in defense, because of the amount of money involved and the corporate profits. So here is a depiction of the U.S. budget, federal defense budget, over the years, and it is inflation adjusted. I think the inflation is $2013. So this is from the CSBA, which is the sort of an NGO outfit in Washington. They do some budget analysis. But if you look at it, again, as I said, it really, you can look at the envelope. There are some sharp peaks from the Korean War to the Vietnam War,
and then Star Wars and so forth. But in between, there are some declines. So after the end of the Cold War, the budget did decline somewhat, and President Clinton was really trying to make conversion from defense to civilian a program of interest, but the Republicans were deadly against, was totally against it, and he didn't succeed. And then as soon as Bush came, this thing just went up. Now that sort of the orange portion is a trick budgetary gimmick. Those are the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And because the Pentagon budget, when you include the cost of war, it was getting so big that they felt even somewhat embarrassed. So they took the cost of war, calling it other contingencies, out of the main budget. And the blue part is the base budget continues. Now this data that I've shown from CSBA only goes up to fiscal year 2017. So now we are fiscal year 2020, and this is the Trump era. And as you know, the budget has gone up. So if we had plotted that, it would almost be a so-called delta function in mathematics. I mean, it will just go up with infinite slope, and so it is so big that now it's approaching. And the thing is, the defense budget also leaves out the expenses for Veterans Administration. So the Veterans Administration is a big number. If you add that, the defense budget is even bigger. So some people in there, in fact, the same guy who produced the historical data also produced some numbers by looking at the overall spending on many different agencies, including Homeland Security and so forth, and found what he called the effective spending on national security. And that is definitely over $1 trillion. So here is a little take from a conservative think tank, Pete Peterson Institute. And here he's showing, because there is criticism, like people like me criticize we're spending so much money compared to the others and so forth. So what they did is put the US budget spending, and that's an older number, like 2 years ago, 649. That number is, of course, as we are discussing, 733, so way up there. And this is China, Russia, India, and France, UK, and Germany, and Saudi Arabia. Now, so if you look at these two numbers, yeah, they look kind of comparable. So this is, what's the big argument? I mean, we are a big power, and all these are spending combined. We're not spending that much more. So I did a little different analysis. So I said, well, let us look at what the United States is spending vis-a-vis its declared enemies or adversaries, principal adversaries, and then some second-tier adversaries. So I plotted these. This is not all adversaries. This is, I mean, India, of course, is now in the sort of in the US orbit, and so is Brazil. So I added all of these up because India is sometimes neutral, so it's not always in the US side. This comes to $411 billion spending by non-US, non-allies. And then I look at the NATO spending. And the NATO spending, this is from the NATO, totaling, I took out the numbers for total NATO, and then it's 270 billion, and then US, and added up US US allies, and come to the number 1.25 trillion that you add to the number of US, 270 for NATO, Saudi Arabia 70, South Korea, Australia, Israel, etc. And then if you look at that in the context of the US spending versus what the adversaries spend, so adversaries, including India and Brazil, who are not adversaries, is 411 versus 1255. And so if you take out India and Brazil, then it becomes about 4 times. US and allies, NATO and others, spend 4 times as much as its adversaries. And then with living India and Brazilian is about 3 times. So enormous spending in the military. So why do we need it? Why do we need to spend that kind of money? And many of these adversaries, while they are capable of carrying out certain asymmetric warfare in cyber domain, et cetera, but so we don't need the kinds of weapon that we build. I mean, we don't need an aircraft carrier to beat Taliban in Afghanistan, for example. So now I will go talk about the military-industrial complex that supports this almost, what I would argue, unsupportable budget spending and the policies. So if you haven't read it, it is worthwhile to read this farewell speech by President Eisenhower. He was leaving office 1961, and he gave this speech where he coined the term military-industrial complex, where he absolutely correctly figured sort of, it is really visionary to see and to feel what might be the impact of this, what he called this term conjunction of coming together of a huge armaments industry and the military. And he couldn't be more correct today. And he called the term of this conjunction a military-industrial complex. So he was a politician, he was a general, but he was a politician, he was president, but he's still living office. He didn't want to antagonize Congress. So he left left out Congress from the military-industrial congressional complex. I mean, as I have demonstrated, the power of the purse and the appropriations process, Congress is the linchpin in this business. So it is truly military-industrial congressional complex as the 3 core members. And then, of course, it has grown. But Eisenhower, even though he had in his several drafts, Congress included in this, later on deleted it. But the term military-industrial complex, MIC, has stuck because it is relatively short. And even though its scope and it has grown enormously. So not only the Pentagon and the contractors in Congress, we have now, of course, intelligence agencies and the State Department, the NSA, I mean, and so forth. And the media, the think tanks, lobbyists, and universities. If I were to give a normal course of lecture, which I do in Japan, I include a special talk on the relationship between the Pentagon and the universities. And all I'm going to say is that even today, we have a very, very close relation. All universities get so much funding, including MIT. We get about $100 million on campus for relatively open research on campus. And then we get 800 million for Lincoln Laboratory, which in Lexington, that's classified. A lot of it is classified. So MIT itself gets about $1 billion, 900 million or so every year from the Pentagon. And then you have universities like Johns Hopkins, UCLA, Georgia Tech, just enormous amounts of money from the Pentagon. And that has been going on ever since the start of the Second World War and continued. And so we do a lot of research that feeds into these design and building up these weapon systems. And we work with the intelligence agencies as well. And then the power, not only that Congress is influenced by it and so forth, but in real terms, the military-industrial complex employs large numbers of people. So just 3 million is within the Pentagon. I mean, within the military, DOD. And then you have all these contractors, all these other, the universities, the media, you have it, what have you, and millions others. So it is a hugely influential employer. And so I drew up this cartoon that sort of shows the elements of the military-industrial complex. So, of course, the White House and the NSC, the National Security Council, that is the heart of the central part of the military-industrial complex. That's where all the policies makers come together. The National Security Advisor chairs the NSC, and he controls all the interactions of the agencies and other things. I mean, obviously, non-governmental agencies are not part of that, but they influence NSC decisions greatly because there is a tremendous revolving door of you go out of NSC, then you become part of the Brookings Institute or whatever, you get a job, then you get in the next administration, you get in as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of something, then the administration goes, you come out, you take another job at a defense contractor like SAIC or something. So around the Beltway, you got this huge organization of people that work here. So that's just sort of a visual way of conceptualizing who is playing in this arena. And one thing that's very important, along with the military-industrial complex, is that the whole thing got started with the Second World War and post-Second World War, but the Manhattan Project is the primary event that started this process of this complex, where first time scientists at universities got very closely associated with the Pentagon. And another thing that created or that arose from the Manhattan Project is secrecy. I mean, of course, we had secrecy before, but nothing like what started with the nuclear weapons project. Because correctly, that nuclear weapons projects had to be secret. We were trying to keep the bomb secret from not only Hitler, but also from Soviet Union and other potential adversaries from Japan, etc. So secrecy was absolutely necessary. But this then translated into secrecy in budgets. Secrecy of scientific information is one thing, but secrecy of budget. Then we justified it by saying, well, if they know this budget line, and if they know the amount of money we're spending, so we know the enemy will figure out what we are up to. Now, there is some logic to that, but there is always has to be a balance. And what happened is this is a complete sort of growth of secret budgets, classifications like special access programs and things of that sort, where the primary purpose really became that you want to keep information secret out of the public view, out of the oversight of even congressional committees. I mean, President Truman, when he became president, had no inkling about the nuclear weapons program at Los Alamos. He knew nothing. Everything was kept out of view from his and funded out of some special funding project. This is the president of the United States. He didn't know at all anything. And so Eisenhower was very cognizant because he knew the system very well. He was such an enormous personality in the Pentagon. So he came in with this knowledge, and even he was so surprised when he found the plan by Curtis LeMay, who was the Air Force chief, that general, that about the nuclear war, what Curtis LeMay was planning of a complete devastation of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower was completely shocked when he found that out. So the black budget, it's only a few years ago that even the top line of the CIA budget, nobody could even say how much CIA spent total. And now at least we know what CIA's budget is total, NSA and so forth. This was totally out of reach before. Let me see, how am I doing for time? Okay. I have said many of these things about what is driving the defense budget politics of jobs, and but one thing I would also mention that there is generally a broad consensus about America's role in the world and its foreign policy has large popular support. It's not that people don't support it. And I think people believe there is some kind of an exceptionalism that America, USA is an exceptional nation. And if not us, then who? So the strength of the defense lobby derives from this fundamental beliefs of people, of American values, that we are a force for good in the world, and so forth. So the politics of defense spending is rather complicated. And that's what keeps like programs. This is just a quick slide to show the, what if I get, when in the third session, talk about the ballistic missile program, and that enormous amounts of money is being spent in building a missile shield that started with Reagan. So that program that was called the Strategic Defense Initiative was a massive failure, massive, and waste of taxpayer money. It was all science fiction. Most of the projects had no basis in science, and I was part of it. So it tried to develop this so-called missile shield with lasers, with all kinds of weapons, and then interceptors, which employing what's called the hit-to-kill technology, strike the incoming missile. And most of them are really science fiction. And they had programs for systems in space called Brilliant Pebbles and Brilliant Eyes. Brilliant Eyes were basically space-based radars, space-based lasers for doing radar function, and then Brilliant Pebbles, which could knock out from space-based platforms incoming missiles from the Soviet Union. None of these came to fruition. Any one of them didn't work. And President H.W. Bush, the first Bush, was smart enough to scale it back in 1989-90 after the Cold War ended. And but it didn't stop. President Bush tried to cancel the program. He couldn't succeed. Congress wouldn't let him do it. So when I was in Congress in the late 90s, it went into what is called a keep alive mode. That means the contractors had enough congressional support to put in about $5 billion a year to keep all these different programs that were absolutely science fiction type, keep them going until an opportunity arose, which was the election of George W. Bush. As soon as he was elected, this missile defense budget just went right up. And since 2000, it has been spending $12 billion a year. Now the Democrats and Republicans all agree, yeah, we got to do missile defense. And $12 billion a year, which in my calculation is $240 billion so far. And then we had spent $100 billion in the 80s during the Reagan Star Wars strategic initiative. So over $300 billion already under the bridge. And really no effective system have come out. They repeatedly fail. And one of them was it's called the ABL, airborne laser. And I was part of it on the Congressional Review. And I knew something about lasers because I had worked in my other life as an engineer in the high power lasers. And I knew it was a technology that was absolutely not there to be put on an airplane like a 747, which would fly around on a loiter mode. And if you see a missile coming, it was totally autonomous. It would have its own radar and so forth. And it doesn't need cueing from anything, an autonomous platform, massive standoff distances, 400 miles or so from wherever. So if the missile is launched from Iran or whatever, we can just take it out with the speed of light and gone. And my main argument was the laser was not ready, even for laboratory. I mean, they didn't have any data. I went out to Hughes Aircraft, which was building the laser, and it's a chemical laser, so naturally very big. It uses hydrogen and fluorine gases as lasing media. And so I asked them to show me the data of the lasing. Oh, the system is down today. Well, system is down, but wasn't it up a few days ago? You had presented the data somewhere. There's no data. So they had a few seconds of data, and you cannot make a workable system which does not have some reliable operation in the laboratory. And so I had recommended in 1998 to Congress in the House Armed Services Committee, I wrote a confidential memo that saying that this thing should not be funded at that level. It should be funded at level just to do R&D at the table in the laboratory. And of course, the contractors were out there. This was Hughes Aircraft, Boeing, Lockheed, and they just pushed the congressman and they funded it. So it got funded fairly high level, and 5, 6, 7 years later, it got canceled because they couldn't demonstrate anything in the laboratory, and their laser was so big, it wouldn't fit in the airplane. So, but they had already sold the airplane, and Boeing, of course, we know that 737 MAX is not working, but Boeing made a reasonably good airplane, which was 747. So they quickly sold Pentagon 2 747s to fly the experimental lasers, but the lasers were not there. So they had champagne because Boeing 747 flew around in the first flight. Well, I think it has many hours of flying, but anyway, that's the way it goes. So GAO, where I worked after I left Congress, this cannot read very well, but the slide should be available and you can read it. They list all 20 or so major programs each year. And this was from 2, 3 years ago. There were some folks from GAO, I don't know if they're here, but this is from the GAO report from a few years ago. And they have a report every year to Congress giving data about what the programs are doing, how the budget is overrunning, blah, blah, blah. So all these programs are there. So you can read them, the Global Hawk. And I mentioned a couple of times the Joint Strike Fighter, and Joint Strike Fighter is the F-35 aircraft, which is really overrunning. So on the right-hand side, you'll see all these overruns in budgets and schedules, but they keep on going. GAO writes hundreds of reports, and so why do these programs keep going? So I've discussed some of these as we went along, but the defense contractors keep the pressure on Congress to not cut the defense budget, of course, for profits. Create defense contractors also create high-paying jobs. So it employs a lot of very good scientists and engineers. So very well-paid jobs. I had one of them. And then there is the ideological reason of fighting communism and terrorism. And as I had mentioned about that, America's exceptionalism. So a lot of these are feeding into the reasons for, but here's one practical thing. The contractors are very smart. So this is a slide from Boeing from the ABL program, the Airborne Laser Program. When they were briefing Congress, and they had this slide, so I had it from the briefing. And this shows all the locations of the contract facilities for ABL. So very critical, California, Texas, Massachusetts, up in Washington, of course, Boeing is there. And so all these facilities are created with where there is influential congressional votes are located. So if the congressmen suddenly decide that, oh, I've got this confidential memo from Subraya Ghoshra on the committee staff, and he's saying that this should not be funded at these levels, I'm going to take a look. There's going to be a lot of pressure from the people who work on these programs in the congressional districts, and the congressmen usually are quite fearful of that. And so my concluding remarks, maybe just try to read it. Corrupting influence of money in American politics, Eisenhower's predictions, programs continue with support from Democrats and Republicans. That's important to remember that in this fight, there are very little difference how Democrats and Republicans behave in Congress and keeping these budgets going. So critical reports by agencies like GAO and others don't make a whole lot of difference, unfortunately. Many reports come out of that the programs are failing to deliver what they promised, and they're behind schedule, they are over budget, and all this stuff, and they're routinely ignored. And then on the top of it, of course, we have the whole problem of secrecy on these programs, even now. The missile defense program, for instance, is so secret. It's not top secret, it's secret, but getting data on the program is very, very, very difficult. So I have a list of readings that I suggest. So if you, let's see how I can get you this information. Can we post this? Okay, so we'll post this on the Radius right away, and then it'll be, of course, courtesy of Humuk and others. It'll be on YouTube. But for the reading, and Yarden, if you have any suggested reading, maybe we can include that and give that to the Radius so people can have it. So with that, I really wanted to have some time for discussion. So we have about 20 minutes and even more if people have time. So thank you very much for your attention, and let's have some questions. And for questions, we have set up this microphone just because we're live streaming, so people can, so it is, we don't have a wireless. So if people could come out and ask the question, that'd be great. So please don't be shy, please. Yes.
My voice projects.
Your voice projects. Oh, okay. Okay. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I think I'm unshared. Okay. Okay.
So I know your background is more on the legislative side, but could you speak a little bit about sort of the funding mechanisms that defense contractors are using to help with the lobbying efforts to help maintain their funding?
Yeah, well, if you look at, now I don't have exact data on this, but all these contractors spend quite a bit of money. Let's say the program like a missile defense, which is a cash cow for many contractors because they don't have to deliver much. There is a missile defense, organized missile defense lobby. They have breakfast meetings at the Capitol Hill Club every week. I've been to many of them. And so they invite congressional staffers. They invite even sometimes congressmen, and give pep talks about how good the missile defense is and so forth, and why you should fight like that. But their main influence is really the contributions to the campaign funds of key congressional congressmen and women. And there's many mechanisms. They have defense corporations, I know, sometimes use this, they roll up all the contributions from employees and so forth, and then channel it through PACs on the contractor community. One interesting thing that is, you know, in defense business, this is pure socialism. There is no private money. This is absolutely all taxpayer money. So the Pentagon gives defense contractors money for R&D. On top of it, it'll give you overhead, huge, lavish overheads, sometimes 100% overhead that covers all kinds of expenses. So when a company like Boeing, Grumman, or others are lobbying, it's so strange that a lot of this money is actually our money. It's just being circulating in with different labels. Because one time I ran into this, companies have an account for doing internal R&D. It's separate from a contract. Like you have a contract from Pentagon to Boeing to do certain things. Now, Boeing creates, I should name names, but some defense contract, yeah, it creates its own internal research and development budget, IR&D, IRAD. And this IRAD, one would think that this is actually corporate money because they are doing cutting edge stuff that they want to sort of keep secret for whatever products they want to make. It is not. It is actually coming out of the overhead budgets that they are getting from larger contracts. So having large contracts give these defense companies a lot of latitude in siphoning off money to then cycle back and lobby Pentagon generals and contractors. And you have the revolving door. You are a top defense official, a colonel, a lieutenant general, or whatever. And after you're finished with your service, then you just walk across the river, the Potomac, and go start working for SAIC. And then who the SAIC is getting the money from? From the Pentagon. And now you're making, as the vice president of SAIC, or Lockheed or Boeing, huge amounts of money. Many of my colleagues on the congressional committee ended up getting extremely big jobs in Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed, et cetera, and not to mention the Pentagon. So the revolving door is another technique of how these things happen. And congressmen really feel very unnerved when they face criticism from these big corporations, because they know they're going to face their employees or some employees in their district, and they'll be very vocal, letter writing, dear colleagues, and all that stuff. Anybody wants to come up? Yeah, please. You can just line up.
Hi. So.
And if you say who you are, maybe.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm Julia McDonald. I'm from Wellesley.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So I was wondering, you showed the chart from the Peterson Institute.
Yeah, right.
Does that suggest that conservative think tanks and other policy researchers are also of the mind that defense spending needs reform? Or is it just on the Democratic side?
Well, I think places like Cato Institute on the conservative side.
Oh, yes.
Ask your question again.
Yes. Okay. So my question was, are conservative and Democratic policy researchers aligned in their thinking on whether or not defense spending needs reform?
There is really, maybe answer the question that way. The broad consensus on national security is very bipartisan. As I was saying, that there is not a very big difference between Democrats and Republicans about the level of funding and things. That's why the defense budget never goes down. It just always goes up. It is so much easier to keep this juggernaut moving and feeding from it. So there's just this material reason for why they support it, other than the stuff that I talked about, the exceptionalism and global domination and things like that. Some conservatives, like the Cato Institute, are critical of the overall spending. There's a deficit hawks and things like that. So they would criticize the defense spending in the same vein as they're criticizing the deficits and the budget. So they would criticize the social spending as much as they would criticize the defense spending, because they want to cut the size of the government down. But for most people, it's not the case. It's the defense is a sacred cow. It is a completely different entity when it comes to deliberations in politics and in legislation things. So it's a third rail. You just don't want to touch it.
Hi, Mike Passerini, Mass P Section, Blue Rose Democrats. I read this article in the New York Times recently about hypersonic weaponry, and it was very alarmist. And this the writer who'd been in a very high up governmental position had was talking about hypersonics like they were this new apocalyptic, weapon. And he says the title of the op-ed is their game changer. He's saying, oh, we can evade air defenses, and it shrinks the amount of time that leaders have to respond to a strike or something, and so forth. And what really amazed me is that these problems, exist already with nuclear weapons. You don't, hypersonic weapons just kind of add another layer to the pie. And of course, what he doesn't mention is the people who are going to profit from building American hypersonic weapons, which is the US has been pursuing for 20 years now.
More.
I guess more than that. So using that as an example or a point of departure, how do you think people outside of the industry, whether it's people in, the legislative branch of government, or whether it's, or just people in civil society, how do you kind of derail this just new kind of toy every year, every 10 years that comes down the line, because it's just something new comes down the line and it just perpetuates this. Well, we need to build it, then build counter defenses to it, et cetera. And so
Right,
forth.
right. Thank you. Yeah, right. Well, I mean, that's the difficult question is, there is the issue of the public's awareness about these things. Most people think it's just too esoteric. Who's going to talk about hypersonic, Mach 20 weapons and stuff? Same with nuclear weapons. I think that our problem is that people don't even know how many nuclear weapons still exist in the world and how close we are, especially now that all of the treaties governing nuclear weapons are about to be gone. We have a last one left, and that expires next year at the start. And if Trump pulls out of that, we have no treaties. And if you read the history of this madness that got started in the 50s and 60s with people like Curtis LeMay, and then the counterparts in Russia, that we build up this enormous arsenal of 50, 60,000 nuclear weapons until we finally realized that this madness must stop. And then the Republican president, Nixon and Brezhnev, signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972. And that became the centerfold of arms control, that it led to so much arms reduction. So now we are in a state where Russia is not the USSR. It doesn't have the kinds of resources and power as the USSR did at once. So I think a lot of our military planners, especially those who are from the Star Wars days, are now back in the office. It's very interesting that Michael Griffin, who was the chief technologist or something like that under the SDIO program under General Abramson in the 80s, Michael Griffin, who then became the NASA administrator, is now back at the Pentagon as Undersecretary for Technology. And he is on record, and I've quoted this in my piece on the condemning the Indian anti-satellite test, that Michael Griffin wants to put a space weapon, want to test a space weapon in 2023. Now, these things are not in the press. This is like a Beltway Press Defense One or something where I read, because I read this stuff a little bit, and nobody else talks about this. that why is this vintage Star Wars guy back in the Pentagon doing his Star Wars thing? He wanted to put a laser, again, laser weapons, space-based lasers, all of this stuff are now again on the cards. The money is flowing. I mean, the budget is huge. So the money is flowing and the contractors love it. So I think as far as popular, I shouldn't call it resistance, even awareness about these things, I mean, that is our task as much as we can, is on the hypersonic weapons. It's a game changer, yes, and I think that it is of much concern to the military because this is an asymmetric weapon that Russia can deploy and has reportedly already deployed a Mach 2020. I was in Russia last year and I talked to some people, and so they are very convinced that with this hypersonic weapon, they can beat whatever US missile defense system is put up. And the funding for their program is still much lower than ours. I mean, our budget, let's say, is 700 billion. I'm just saying for our numbers. Russian budget is 55. I mean, look at it. It's what can they do with this kind of money compared to what we can do with our money? So they can do these asymmetric things, and it is very dangerous because the hypersonic weapons are going to be very hard to detect and very hard to fight because their travel speeds are so much faster. They can get there so quickly, and so yeah, it's really of concern. The only positive thing I can say is here in MIT. We of course had an example of how one of our alumni came up with this brilliant idea of nuclear freeze, and this happened in the mid '80s when it pulled out 1 million people in Central Park in New York. So it's possible. It's possible that despite the fact that people just eyes just glaze over when you talk about this thing, that it is possible that something will strike and the people are going to be so scared that we need to do something and things will happen. But in the meantime, we have to keep this light burning somehow that people understand and let more people know about it. I mean, that's the thing that motivates me to keep talking about it. Most of the time I don't get as many people as here today. So thank you so much for coming. It's 7 o'clock and we can continue the discussion after this informally. And if there is any other question, maybe you can come up and ask, or I'll be around for a little bit longer. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. People signed the attendance sheet, so I can turn it on.